So I was asked to put in something in this set of lectures about value creation. So here it is. So in this lecture we're going to talk about value creation. What do we mean when we talk about value? How we measure it? And can we use notions of value to think of a possibly suitable and sustainable business model, one that's going to work in the long term? As we do this, I'm going to go back to a more quantitative way of thinking, okay, but this should actually mean that any associated exam or coursework questions will actually be easier to do. Okay, and as you've seen already, there's certain problems in accounting and finance that you really can't answer unless you look at them quantitatively. So what we're going to talk about today is some initial ways in which you might start to think about defining and measuring value and how that might then transfer to a underlying business model. Okay, and when you develop the business model, what you want to do is use the notion of value creation to think about something that's going to be sustainable and successful in the long term. And we'll discuss a conceptual mathematical model for this later in this lecture. So in terms of an outline of this lecture, so by way of introduction, try and talk a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about value. Then we'll talk about value extraction in a historical context. So again, note the importance here of a historical perspective, even though we're talking about financial technology. Also, you could potentially get quite a lot of useful information out from historical examples that go a long way back in time. Then, as promised, we'll talk about a conceptual mathematical model for value creation. So this is quantitative, and this is really the only way to think about certain aspects of economics and finance in enough depth. We'll talk about a certain need for caution, and then some conclusions at the end of the lecture. Now, some references at the end, and unusually for the things I usually teach, it's probably actually worth going through these references in quite a lot of detail. Okay, so another multifaceted subject, and what you should see here is a sort of marriage of some historical examples and a numerical model in order to get to grips with some of the fundamental economics and financial issues that are at play here. So the first natural question to ask then is, what is value? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary variously defines value as the amount of money something is worth and the importance or usefulness of something. Now, a very common mistake is to think that these two things are actually the same, but they are not. And indeed, it's these differences between these two definitions which arguably makes the world go round. So the important thing here to bear in mind is the economics of appropriation. So the basic question is, rather vulgarly, how do you expect monetary value from the obvious intrinsic value that your services provide? Okay, now alongside this, if you look at historical examples, there can sometimes be an unsettling separation between technological innovation and commercial success. So I've discussed some of these key examples in the previous parts of these lectures. So examples might include a consideration of TVR versus Porsche. So TVR was thought to be the better technical car, Porsche was obviously more successful. VHS versus Betamax. VHS was more successful in the video cassette market. I'm not sure there was much technical difference between the two products. And Concorde, brilliant technical product, supersonic flight, commercial flop. So alongside this potentially unsettling separation between technological innovation and commercial success, you also need to be aware here of potentially conflicting definitions of value. So you've got two things here that look the same, but unfortunately they are not. So you can think of value both in terms of monetary worth, and you can think of value as being intrinsic importance. these two things aren't necessarily the same. So a recent, all too pertinent example would be the current coronavirus crisis. For example, if you compare the monetary wages of NHS staff, key workers, versus the wages paid to, say, footballers and movie stars. Note that one group of people is paid significantly more than the other, but during the lockdown, for instance, one group of workers couldn't work, the other group of workers was too important to not work. Okay, so note the above definition of key workers includes previously unheralded occupations such as supermarket workers and delivery drivers. So these people potentially provide an awful lot of value that isn't measured if you just look at the amount of money that these people are paid. And you need to be aware of this distinction here, that monetary worth isn't necessarily the same as intrinsic importance. Now we're talking about value in this lecture, and indeed value creation. You need to be aware here, as an aside, that value may also mean information in fintech settings, precisely because this is a computer science thing. So there's a question in relation to the appropriacy of a blockchain application. Shreya 2020 asks, does the process or activity involve a transfer of value? So really, value could mean information, and this is not restricted to purely monetary notions of value. For instance, the original Bitcoin blockchain used noughts and ones to signify payment and receipt of payment. Okay, but in different contexts, not just currency context, value transfer could refer to just the transfer of information. This information could be encoded by noughts and ones, but wouldn't necessarily relate to currency like Bitcoin. So there's all sorts of non-monetary examples that this might include, so things like patient medical records or digital identity profiles. Okay, so just as blockchain is potentially much more than just the technical gubbins that sits behind Bitcoin and some other digital currencies, okay, value may mean all sorts of things other than money. So in summary then, value is subjectively defined, so you can think of it in terms of either monetary worth or intrinsic importance. Much as you would like it to be the case, these things aren't always the same, and indeed differences between these two definitions are arguably what makes the commercial world go round. So if you look at this deeply, there may be significant discrepancies depending on whether you look at value in terms of the amount of money that something is worth versus the importance or usefulness of something. And a key, albeit slightly pious example, might be if you look at the current coronavirus crisis and say NHS and key workers versus say pop stars and footballers. You need to be aware of what exactly you mean in terms of value creation when you're looking at business and finance. It's not always easy to extract monetary value from services with significant intrinsic value. So examples of that might include teaching, research, education, etc. Unsettlingly, a lot of the services that universities typically provide. It's also important to appreciate the value that different people provide, and that this may be a separate issue to questions of monetary worth. Okay, so value is potentially a many splintered thing, not just purely monetary thing. So if we're interested in value extraction, it's again very instructive to look at the historical perspective, and again I think it can be surprising just how far back in time you can go and still find meaningful examples. So historically, value extraction has often occurred as part of key innovations, and there's usually an association with new technologies or an influx of new investors. You can see both elements at play within Bitcoin and blockchain. Within this, when you talk about value extraction, it's often best, I think, to view technology as a democratizing process. Okay, so the basic idea behind that is to try and make everything as potentially popular as possible and expand the potential size of your market to its fullest. So, for instance, if you've got some technological innovation like blockchain, what you want to try and do is try and make the benefits of progress available to the wider society as a whole. And the way this has been done historically is to make the size of the available market as large as possible. So the classic example pre-COVID would be the rise of, say, cheap air travel, and the extent to which holidays and indeed foreign holidays became seen as almost an entitlement rather than a luxury. So I wanted to here try and outline some potentially contemporary examples of value creation. Now, in doing this, I wanted to try and get you to think explicitly about what it is you want a fintech solution to achieve. Okay, so Bitcoin and blockchain, clearly great things. There's clearly some genuine innovation there, but exactly what value is this creating? So just sort of thinking aloud, some of the things that might be generating value might be things like, can cryptocurrencies and new electronic payment systems make credit cheaper and easier to obtain? Can you reduce the cost of transactions? So the classic example here is currency conversions across borders. And I think there's potentially all sorts of new values that can be extracted from new technologies. So who had heard of Zoom a year ago, for instance? So there's all sorts of new digital ways of working from home. There's the potential for significant cost savings in terms of office space, commuting costs, etc. Enhanced flexibility might be beneficial to society, but perhaps also there's a social cost if people aren't interacting with each other as much. Perhaps also you will see, as financial technology develops, more informal ways of communicating value. So another thing to emphasize here as we talk about creating value, new technologies are likely to be a panacea. New technologies may have significant downsides associated with them. So for instance, do cryptocurrencies enable more people to conduct undesirable behaviours? For example, criminal behaviours like money laundering, or just societally disadvantageous behaviours like excessive speculation. For instance, if you make credit easy to obtain, e.g. via payday loans, okay, it's a good thing that extra credit is made available potentially, but do customers have the requisite levels of financial literacy to understand the new forms of credit that may be available? I had a paper published on this a couple of years ago. Suppose you've got new technologies that enable new working from home, new ways of working from home. Does that also come with social costs? For instance, businesses associated with commuting or built up around people working in offices, going out for lunch, etc. There's also a enduring possibility that new technologies lead to significantly reduced demand for labour, and extra work can be generated by online presence, so things like social media accounts, websites, having to check your email every day, for instance. Not always a one-sided benefit when new technology comes in. Okay, so in terms of value creation via new technologies, the classic mode that this works is that technologies are thought to provide value, things like making things faster, making things cheaper, and therefore available to more people. So again, whenever you're looking at creating value through technology and indeed fintech, remember that this thing is intended to function as a democratizing process. A classic example in recent history would have been the rise of cheap air travel. New technology, especially with regard to finance, may also make things more secure. And another thing to watch out for with applications in, say, accounting and finance and law in mind would be increased automation. Okay, so you've got a wish list of 4 items there. Note that not all technologies would be able to accomplish all of these things. For example, blockchain technology is unsuited really to speeding up routine processes, but may be able to accomplish aspects of points 2 to 4, depending on how many of the aspects of the Oxford blockchain strategy framework are satisfied. Okay, so there's all sorts of ways in which new technology can create value, but I think you need to be very specific about what is and what is not achievable.